I was thinking about some of your pieces and would tell me, honestly, how you would react to my thinking that maybe to some extent it's sort of like Norman Rockwell with a twist. Is that accurate, or am I completely off base?
It has been described before. A friend of mine, Kelly Knauer, says it's Norman Rockwell meets Norman Bates.
Welcome to In Our Town, Conversations with Springfieldians Making a Difference. I'm your host, Tom Carlson, publisher of the Springfield Daily Citizen. If you'd like to comment on this episode, our email is inourtown@sgfcitizen.org. We'd love to hear from you. My special guest today is a Springfield artist with a national following. Julie Blackmon is a photographer who counterposes familiar family scenes from her Rountree neighborhood with subtle objects that make you do a double take on her photographs. Her pieces are in demand by major art galleries in Kansas City, Chicago, Los Angeles, and New York. Her work hangs in permanent collections in major art museums throughout the United States and has been exhibited in the Louvre in Paris. She has published 3 books of her photographs. The most recent was selected by the New York Times as one of the 20 best picture books for 2022. Julie joins me today to talk about her career as an artist with Bill Haw of the Haw Contemporary Art Gallery in Kansas City. Julie and Bill, welcome to In Our Town.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks,
an honor
Tom.
to be here.
Well, it's exciting, and I'm really glad to have you guys here. And Julie and I are good friends. She's good friends with my wife, Chandler, so she was kind enough to join me today, and I do appreciate that as well. So, Julie, you're a Missouri State grad. Why don't you tell our listeners about how you got started in photography?
Oh, gosh. Well, it probably goes back to actually Missouri State. I remember taking my first photo class and being introduced to the work of the greats like Diane Arbus. At the time, in the mid-'80s, Sally Mann had just started her work, Immediate Family, about her children. And anyway, the images that my professor was putting up for us to see at that time, and I had just taken it as a class for credit, just blew me away. And I thought, wow, this looks like kind of what's going on at my home that I'd walk 2 blocks from with 8 younger siblings and their garage sales and donut boxes and my sister in charge who was like 7. Anyway, I just thought this is something I could do. And so it wasn't long before I was just way into it and taking more classes. But I ended up getting married pretty young, 23, 24, had 3 kids of my own, and I really didn't get back to it until I was 35. But that was the hook, is school.
Now, you mentioned some artists that you said were very influential. Not everybody who listens to this will be familiar with those names. Can you tell us what it was about their work that resonated with you?
I don't know. It's hard to describe in words because it was such an emotional reaction. It was kind of a visceral feeling of just the power of that image. You don't know in a photograph compared to a film what happened the moment before or the moment after. You just have that little snippet in time. And maybe there's something just to the fact that it stops time. And I could see the similarities to the things. It kind of really helped me see the richness in what I thought was a very chaotic life at home, with all of those kids. And there was a lot of stress and tension. And all of a sudden I thought, oh my God, I'm the luckiest person in my entire class because I can just go 2 blocks away and come back with these riveting images. Not because I was so great, but because it was just all laid out in front of me. And it seems like even now and then, it's still like the subject matter laid out in front of me here in Springfield is endless.
So you get married at 23, have 3 kids, you've got major mom duties, but you have a basement with a dark room, right?
In 98, we moved into a big old fixer-upper on Meadowmere Street, this historic home that was famous for having been where the first photography business in Springfield started.
Is that right? I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah. So there was an old dark room in the basement, the long sinks with the brass fixtures. I mean, it had to have been 100 years old. And so I think it was the birth probably of Grace, my second child, who had some issues, who's developmentally disabled. I really needed kind of another focus. And at the time, my sisters are, I think it's time you get that dark room up and going, and they helped me, and I did. And I really just started, though, thinking, I'm just going to get some pictures of my kids to hang on the wall. I wanted it to look like Pottery Barn in my living room.
Well, most of your subject matter comes right here from the Rountree neighborhood.
Yes.
And you're a denizen of Rountree. I think your maiden name was Arnold.
Yes.
I remember the Arnold family, and you were the oldest of 9, so you have
Yes.
a lot of subject matter, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and now all of them have children. So, right, it's just, like I said, it's endless. And it's happening right in front of me, too. I have a sister, I think you walked by one day when they were putting the garage together. And they've got a little 6-month-old. And so I'm seeing them every day, too, and the things they're into. And so it's...
I like art. I collect a lot of it, but if you were to look at it, you'd think there's room for improvement here. But I was thinking about some of your pieces, and would tell me, honestly, how you would react to my thinking that maybe to some extent it's sort of like Norman Rockwell with a twist. But is that accurate, or am I completely off base?
It has been described before. A friend of mine, Kelly Knauer, says it's Norman Rockwell meets Norman Bates.
I think. Well,
so yeah,
well,
that's funny. You guys both came up with that.
Well, Kelly, as you know, is a good friend of both of ours, and has written New York Times books for his, 20 years or longer,
right.
And so I'll defer to Kelly in that regard. I remember years ago going to the Springfield Art Museum, and you were doing a talk. It was very well attended, and you were showing us photographs of famous Dutch painters. Mm-hmm. And my sense was you got some ideas for your work from some of those themes. Maybe you could talk about that.
As I told you before, I was inspired initially by the great icons of photography, which typically worked in black and white. And I remember, though, as I got further into school, one of my professors is saying, well, you can't just be Sally Mann. You've got to find your own voice, and you've got to, I think it was actually one of the workshops I went to where they were like, how do you take this into the present, Julie? They can't be, I feel like these are a little bit nostalgic. This is, like 20 years ago, and I'm just sure I've done it in the black and white. And I was like, color? I don't want to work in color. Anyway, but it did, as any class or professor asking you tough questions, it got me thinking, what can I draw inspiration from in my next body of work to move this forward? And I was at Barnes & Noble back when Barnes & Noble was a thing, or that's where you went for ideas or inspiration. And I checked out a couple of the Dutch books on painting. And, there are all those domestic genre scenes. And as old as they were, 500 or 600 years, they seemed contemporary in some ways. There's the work of Jan Steen, these crazy scenes in these taverns where there's kids feeding the dog stuff behind the mom's back, and then there's another kid throwing a fit, and then there's maybe somebody singing and dancing. I don't know. They were so funny. Uh-huh. And I thought it just seemed funny that the humor, as old as those paintings were, seemed contemporary. And I thought, why can't I, with photography, do my own spin on, domestic life, but update it, but still draw and make obvious references to that time period.
Do you think there's sort of a timelessness in the message?
Maybe. I mean, I learned a lot, even besides the moments, just the way they were lit, and sometimes the disappearing vantage points. You'd be looking down a corridor where it would kind of recede. Then another thing that was different than photography is everything was in focus in those paintings. And with the tools available to me at that time, it's like, well, I can do that. I don't have to stick with the rules of the old school photography. Yeah, some of it was just an experiment. I didn't go in with any agenda other than just to try things. And it was really fun for me just to experiment and see what might happen.
How did you get into marketing your art?
I really didn't. I really was just down there in the dark room pretending that I was an artist when I really wasn't. And I finally entered a contest back in 2004 and then another one in 2006. And I ended up winning. 2004, I was like a runner-up. That got me going. And then 2006, I came back. My first body of work from that color work that was along those lines, inspired by Dutch painting. And it was a national competition that I won first in. And then I didn't realize, as a byproduct of that, all these galleries were then coming to me saying, we want to sell your work. And I was like, oh, you do? I didn't even know. I didn't even know that, that I was just happy to win.
Absolutely. But I mean, gee whiz, how many different galleries are representing you now?
6 right now.
Your popularity's just exploded. I might mention a particular art gallery, and unless you're inclined to follow that sort of thing, people might not recognize it. But when I tell them, well, gee whiz, Elton John's got your stuff, and Drew Barrymore, is that
Reese Witherspoon.
Reese
I like
Witherspoon.
her too. I hope she has.
Their eyes light up and they say, oh, no kidding. But Bill, you're in the gallery business, not to mention many other pursuits. What is it about Julie's work that people like so much and seek out?
Well, I think there's a lot of things. The thing that initially attracted me to it was that it didn't feel like anybody else's work. I think that was one thing. And then the next thing, and maybe this is because I come from the Midwest or because I'm a certain age, but there was this kind of familiarity to it mixed with this kind of surreal thing that was going on as well that just didn't really feel like anything else. And I think probably a lot of people in the Midwest do respond to the work particularly well because I think it reminds us all of growing up here.
Well, and you say growing up here. In fact, I believe my high school English teacher, Fern Westbrook, was your grandmother. Am I right about that?
She was, and we actually, I grew up in Kansas City, but we spent a lot of time here in Springfield and actually in the Rountree and Delaware neighborhoods.
Yeah, and Judge Hank Westbrook is your uncle?
He sure is.
He sings key in church, I will say that. But he does make a joyful noise to the Lord.
I hope he's not listening to this podcast. He might beg to differ.
You tell me, but my sense is you get every piece that Julie produces and then go ahead and market it or purchase it. I don't know which. But anyway, I think it might be interesting to tell us a little bit about that process.
Sure. So one thing that's interesting about photographers or artists who make multiples, which would be like lithographs or silk screens or things where there's multiple copies of each one available, it's really easy for them to get their work into galleries across the country or even across the world. And generally the way it works with Julie's work and with most editioned work is that the galleries that represent that artist all have access to the work. They all have the right to sell it. And then, it's kind of a free-for-all. Whoever works the hardest is the one that gets to sell it. And then, like with Julie's work, it's relatively small editions. So it comes in small, medium, and large. And right now the trend is 10 of each. So there's only 30 total, to address a demand that's pretty big now. So a lot of it sells out quickly.
I see.
But thankfully, we're able to sell a lot of it here in the Midwest and outside of the Midwest. And again, I think that may come back to just the way that it resonates here.
I know your work, Julie, is very popular with a lot of our friends here in Springfield. One of my close friends, I think it was the riverboat piece that you did recently, bought it for his wife for Christmas, and she just lit up like a Christmas tree when she saw that. So what is the message that you're trying to convey when you juxtapose what's more or less a normal family neighborhood scene with something that seems a little bit out of place?
Well, I guess first of all, I'd start by saying, it's easy when I'm talking about my life and I'm talking about this work as inspiring my life to see it literal. But in fact, they're fictions. I'm setting things up as a filmmaker would and telling my own stories. And I think it's not so much about my life, but kind of metaphors like the stress and the chaos and the crazy scenes. Everyone thinks they're about the kids. In some ways, they're not about the kids, It's sometimes it's like, well, where's the mother here? The absent mother, that might indicate, what's the psychological thing going on here? Not tangibly what's going on,
Right.
but what level of stress. There's some stress and chaos and tension here. And I don't know, sometimes I don't always know. Sometimes what I do too, in addition to maybe it's a psychological state, sometimes it's just simply social commentary. Paddleboard is an image of my sister, who's 9 months pregnant at the time, on a paddleboard. And I don't know if you're familiar with paddleboards, but it's really actually kind of hard to stand up on one, let alone when you're 9 months pregnant. And then in addition to her standing up on it 9 months pregnant, she's got her little toddler son on the very end. And then she's got a stack of about 4 or 5 coolers descending in size. So she's seriously moving some cargo down the river. But the whole thing...
Multitasking.
Yeah, to say the least, right? I set it up because it's an impossible situation. And it was about the time Roe v. Wade was overturned in June, and that was on my mind. It was maybe just the suggestion of the impossibility that women face. But you could also read it depending on how you wanted it. I like it being open-ended too, as a real reverence to life, which I, of course, have as well.
We'll be right back after this short break.
Hi, this is Rantzberger from the Springfield Daily Citizen. I'm here with my friend and colleague, Corey Madison. And Corey, you and I made history here at the Daily Citizen.
That's right, Rance.
The first duo to have a double byline on a story.
For journalism people, or at least for this journalism person, that is the dorkiest, coolest thing. We each put in some work onto a story and get it in the best shape to put it out there into the world.
Teamwork makes good journalism, and our team certainly can't do our jobs without the help of subscribers like you, subscribers to the Springfield Daily Citizen. In Our Town listeners can get 15% off an annual subscription by going to sgfcitizen.org/town. That is 15% off an annual subscription at sgfcitizen.org/town.
And I'd like to point out that I think I was the first name on that double byline, the first one in history. You might have gotten the first billing on one that's followed.
That's all right. Second billing is still pretty good.
So how about talk about another piece maybe that doesn't have dark overtones?
Oh.
And what you were trying to do with that
Oh,
one.
okay. I would say that would be maybe Metaverse. And I was using some kids in the neighborhood. They're actually neighbors of yours, Ari and Ezra.
I know them well.
And then
Wonderful kids.
their dark skin mixed with my little nieces and nephews in the palette of my sister's house that was undergoing all these renovations, with her green piano and her white walls and then her brown woodwork. Once I got all those kids in there, I knew that just like no matter what I did, it just was so visually stunning. But the idea behind it was, that piece in there, it's called an oculus. It's kind of become the defining little toy of this new metaverse because you're in a different reality as you look through the screen. So there's a little boy with the Oculus on, and then everybody else is doing something completely different within the image. Ari is looking out into the distance, and he's kind of set against a white silhouette, and his brown skin just is geometric in that area. And then his sister, Ezra, is playing that green piano. And I don't know, there was something like as dark as we can see all this disconnect. I kind of created it because it was, to me, a hopeful look into the future where we're all kind of in harmony with the idea of that piano music.
Do these ideas just sort of spring from your forehead, so to speak, or do you noodle on them quite a while?
That's a term. I like that, Tom. Yeah, I probably noodle on it a little ways. Sometimes I just have to get everybody there and then see the visual strength of it. And then, sometimes I'll say, okay, now I know what we're doing next time. And we might shoot it twice. It just depends. I think that day we just all got there and it worked out.
Well, you never know what experiences you have that may help you do something in your career at a later time. And I can't help but think the fact that You were the oldest of 9 kids, having to help mom out raising them from time to time, and you had your own, that you developed a skill set that helped you work with children. I mean, just getting the little fellas to stand still must be a real challenge.
Oh yeah, every shoot is kind of a total nightmare. It really is. Luckily, nobody's drowned or fallen off a boat or anything like that.
So as I was preparing for the interview today, I read some articles about your work. My gosh, you were in the New York Times and CNN and art journals, and at least some of those writers talked about what I would call eternal themes. And a lot of people probably haven't heard about Carl Jung, but they've certainly heard about George Lucas and Star Wars. And George Lucas attributed that work to a man named Joseph Campbell, who was a big fan and follower of Carl Jung, who talked about universal archetypes. And the idea is that as humans, we have this sort of, at a deeper level, a commonality and certain themes. One of the books he's most famous writing about was called The Hero of a Thousand Faces. And the story is there are myths throughout our cultures, but they're all essentially the same story. There's the person who departs from home, goes out and has an adventure, learns from it, and then brings something back to make the family or the group or the tribe better and stronger. And I got the sense that in looking at this, and with your help, of course, by thinking back about like the Flemish painters and so forth, that there are sort of common themes that maybe you're trying to bring out. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that there's probably something to that. I mean, the fact that they keep getting repeated over and over, there's a lot just subconscious within all of us, you know, that, and there's a similarity. Sometimes I'm shocked by what I think is a personal story to me that I'm telling visually is personal to people throughout cultures around the world, you know, and it's.
But your genius, it seems to me, is to take a mundane topic, like kids around the dinner table or whatever you have, and then introduce some object that makes the viewer take a double take and think about maybe there's a deeper message here.
Even if it makes them stop and wonder, maybe that's good enough without there really being a message at all.
So you're not going to say that it's intentional?
I mean, so many of the details I'm putting in are very intentional. A lot of times the strength is visual, you know, and so if people want to read into that there's more, but yeah, usually there is a little more. I did one in 2008. It was based on the book When the Power of Now came out with Eckhart Tolle.
Oh, sure.
And it was this woman lying by a pool looking like she's living the ideal life. And there's a piece of half-eaten chocolate cake and then that book lying next to her. The Power of Now. In the meantime, her baby's in the distance trying to grab a ball in the pool and she looks like she's ready to fall in and drown. So it was like, here's this woman. She's so in the moment, you know, so present. That's the buzz phrase of that book.
Right.
And believe me, I love his work so much. But it's still, I was just having fun with that idea of you're so in the moment that you're zoned out. Your baby's about to fall in the pool. I don't know what I was trying to say with that. It was just maybe trying to figure things out and being overwhelmed. So Oprah Magazine at one point was going to print that, their Live Your Best Life feature in her magazine. And one of the editors called and said, we have a small problem. We feel very uncomfortable with how close that baby is to the edge of the pool.
Well, that was the whole point.
He said, would you feel comfortable moving that baby back? I'm like, no, I'm not going to move the baby back. That is the whole point. I said the same thing, Tom.
Yeah.
And they were just quiet. I don't think they got it. That's the point. What is she saying?
I wonder about this father-in-law who was a great reader of many, many books, told me one time. He said, sometimes if you have a really great author, you're reading his or her stuff so that you understand the creator more than just the story. Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering, with your work, Have you thought about to what extent maybe there's an impulse for the viewer to get to know you better as opposed to maybe your primary motivation being to convey a message?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, there's the darkness I'm talking about. There's darkness in politics. There's struggles that we just all have. That's the human condition. Probably raising my 3 kids, even the years before that, my mom died at a really young age of cancer and died quickly. That's when I had 2 little kids. I was kind of left without any supports. Having a disabled child, you know, in your wildest dreams, that's all every parent's biggest fear. And that happened. And even now with my 3rd one, you know, there's some really difficult things that he's going through with the opioid addiction. And so I'm in the throes of dealing with hard stuff, but I'm kind of determined too. And I have all the beauty in front of me at the same time. You know, I have all this family and all these great things happening, and I feel very, very lucky. But at the same time, it's always probably a balancing act of how to not just sink in despair. But I think on some level, we're all doing that. Like, how do we sort through this?
But you also have family successes to celebrate.
Yeah,
tell us
I do,
about your
I do.
daughter, Stella. I know
well,
she's making news.
She's so successful. She's having to sign all these non-disclosures. I don't even know what I can talk about anymore. Just say she is following around, touring with probably the most famous musician touring in the world today. And she got that job because he saw her video that she made of her cousin here in Springfield, Missouri, and liked how she portrayed a young girl that age, which is in his fan base. That's the typical, and hired her. And that was about a year ago, and she is now the director of fan content and touring around with 4 bodyguards in LA next week for 4 of his concerts. So it was something she didn't even go looking for. It just kind of landed in her lap. But yeah, I'm really excited for her. And then she's doing her own work on the side too, which just keeps getting better and better.
Bill, there's probably some material there for something in the future, don't you think?
I think so. Yeah.
Bill, there's some pretty exciting announcements coming up about a couple pieces of Julie. Why don't you tell us about it?
Sure. Well, one's already been announced, which is the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art in Kansas City has acquired Paddleboard, which is based on a George Caleb Bingham painting, which lives in the Met right now, called Fur Traders Descending the Missouri. So we're really excited about that, and especially excited about a discussion that's beginning about displaying them together in the same room.
Well, that's great. That's very exciting. I know people here in Springfield, all your friends and neighbors are very happy for you about that.
Yeah.
We'll be standing there in front of it the whole time it's up.
So before we close, Julie, I had a question for you. What advice would you give a young person considering a career as an artist?
Well, I'd probably tell them to, before they think about it as a career, sometimes just that amount of pressure can shut you down. I would say first just express yourself, devour other artists' work, and just go as your goal being to produce something that you're proud of and that maybe, if you're lucky, other people can relate to too. And don't put the pressure of career on yourself. I think that can happen just naturally if you approach it first from your heart.
Well, I mentioned Joseph Campbell earlier. He was famous for saying, "Follow your bliss."
Yes, exactly.
And it was based upon actually a Hindu saying, which was being, consciousness, and rapture. And the idea was maybe you're not very conscious, and maybe you don't know who you are, but if you do what you find rapture in, everything else will fall in place.
Oh, I love that.
Bill, I'm going to give you the final word. Where can people go to find out more about Julie's work?
They can go to julieblackmon.com, which is Julie's website. They can go to hawcontemporary.com. And we also developed a website specifically for her last show with us, which I believe you got to see, which is julie-blackmon.com. And there's a lot of great material on there in addition just to the work. So any of those places, I think, can get people pointed in the right direction.
Thank you both, Julie Blackmon and Bill Hall, for being today's guest on In Our Town.
Thank you, Tom. It's great to be here.
Thanks, Tom.
That's it for this week, folks. Many thanks for listening. If you'd like to listen to other episodes, you can visit the Springfield Daily Citizen website at sgfcitizen.org/In Our Town or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.